The phone rang in the office of Charlie Morrison at 2:47 in the afternoon, and when he picked up, the voice on the other end was breathy, soft, almost apologetic. The kind of voice that made men lean in closer, made them think they were being let in on a secret. "Mr. Morrison, this is Marilyn Monroe. I'm calling about Ella Fitzgerald." Morrison leaned back in his leather chair, the expensive kind that squeaked just enough to remind you it cost more than most people's cars, and lit a cigarette. Camel, unfiltered, because he was a man who didn't believe in half measures. He owned the Mocambo, the most exclusive nightclub on Sunset Strip, where Frank Sinatra drank himself philosophical, where Judy Garland cried between sets, where Hollywood came to see and be seen, and pretend that the world outside those velvet ropes didn't exist. His club had a waiting list 3 months long. Presidents had been turned away. European royalty had begged for tables, and Marilyn Monroe, the blonde bombshell, the walking sex fantasy, the girl who wiggled in movies and made men forget their wives and their mortgages and their mortality, wanted to talk about Ella Fitzgerald. Morrison smiled the way men smile when they think they understand women, the way men smile when they believe beauty and brains are mutually exclusive, and they've just been proven right again. "Miss Monroe," he said, his voice smooth as bourbon, warm as a lie, "what can I do for you?" There was a pause, a breath, the sound of her gathering something, some reserve of strength or strategy or both. Then that voice, still soft but with something underneath it now, something that didn't quite match the breathy persona, like finding a knife under a silk pillow. "You can give Ella the booking she deserves." Morrison's smile faded slightly. The cigarette hung between his fingers, forgotten. He'd been avoiding Ella's manager for weeks. Norman Granz kept calling, kept pushing, kept insisting that Ella Fitzgerald was the greatest vocalist alive and deserved the Mocambo stage. And Morrison agreed. In private, alone, with no one to hear him admit it, Morrison agreed completely. Ella was magnificent, possibly the best singer he'd ever heard, and he'd heard them all. Billie Holiday, when she was still sober enough to finish a set. Sarah Vaughan before she got too big for small clubs. Dinah Washington with that voice that could cut glass and heal wounds simultaneously. But Ella was something else. Ella was transcendent, but she was also Negro, and the Mocambo's clientele, wealthy and white, and powerful and paying top dollar to maintain their bubble of exclusivity, had expectations, unspoken expectations, the kind that didn't need to be written down because everyone understood them. Negro performers were for the jazz clubs downtown, for the Negro clubs in Watts, not for the Mocambo, where white women wore mink stoles in 70-degree weather, and white men ordered champagne. They couldn't afford to impress other white men who didn't care. "Miss Monroe," Morrison said carefully, using the tone he reserved for difficult conversations. "It's not that simple." "It's very simple," Marilyn interrupted, and now the softness was gone entirely. The breathy little girl voice evaporated like morning fog, leaving behind something sharp and clear and utterly uncompromising. "You book Ella for a week, prime time, and I'll be there, front row, every single night." Morrison sat up. The leather chair squeaked. Outside his office, the afternoon traffic on Sunset Strip hummed like a distant argument. "You'll attend?" he asked because he needed to be sure he was hearing correctly. Marilyn Monroe didn't just attend clubs, she conquered them. Her presence was an event, a phenomenon, a guarantee of publicity that money couldn't buy. "I'll be photographed attending," Marilyn clarified, and there it was, the strategic mind that nobody wanted to acknowledge because it was easier to focus on her breasts. "Which means every newspaper, every photographer, every gossip columnist in Hollywood will be there too. Earl Wilson, Hedda Hopper, Luella Parsons, the trades, the dailies, everyone." She paused, letting him imagine it. "Your club will be packed, standing room only. You'll sell more champagne in 1 week than you have all year. And every newspaper in America will run photos of Marilyn Monroe at the Mocambo. Which means every reader will know the Mocambo is where the stars go, where the real action is." The silence on the line was longer now. Morrison was calculating, his mind moving through the mathematics of publicity and profit. Marilyn Monroe in his club, every night for a week, would be a publicity tsunami. The cameras would follow her like pilot fish following a shark. The stars would follow the cameras. The wannabes would follow the stars. Even the risk of booking a Negro singer would be eclipsed, drowned out, made irrelevant by the sheer magnitude of Marilyn Monroe sitting front row. It was brilliant, manipulative as hell, but brilliant. "And if I say no?" Morrison asked, because he had to ask, had to maintain the pretense that he was the one with power in this negotiation. Marilyn's laugh was soft, musical, and absolutely terrifying in its confidence. "Then I'll make sure every columnist in town knows that the Mocambo turned down Ella Fitzgerald, the greatest singer alive, and that you personally blocked her career because you think your white customers are too fragile to hear a Negro woman sing. I'll make sure Hedda Hopper writes about it. Luella will write about it. And Walter Winchell will eviscerate you on radio." She paused. "And I'll also mention that I personally tried to attend an Ella Fitzgerald performance at the Mocambo, but you wouldn't book her. which means every wannabe nightclub in LA will immediately book her just to get me through their doors instead of yours. Another pause, longer this time. Your choice, Mr. Morrison. But I'd decide quickly. Norman's been talking to the Tiffany Club, and Ciro's, and they're both very interested. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact delivered in the voice of a woman who'd spent 10 years being underestimated and had learned to weaponize it, had learned that the dumb blonde act was the perfect Trojan horse for a strategic mind that could see 3 moves ahead. Morrison stubbed out his cigarette in the crystal ashtray his wife had given him for his birthday, stared at the smoke curling toward the ceiling, thought about his club, his reputation, his mortgage, his carefully cultivated image as the man who brought Hollywood together. 1 week, he said finally. Prime time, 8 p.m. shows. But Miss Monroe, you'd better show up. All 7 nights. If you miss even one, the deal's off and I'll pull the booking. Oh, I'll show up, Marilyn said, and there was something in her voice now, something warm and real, and almost vulnerable. Ella's my friend. And she hung up before he could ask what she meant, before he could process the strangeness of Marilyn Monroe and Ella Fitzgerald being friends, before he could wonder how that had even happened. What Charlie Morrison didn't know, what nobody knew, because Marilyn Monroe had learned early that the dumb blonde act kept you safe while the real you stayed hidden in a vault somewhere behind your sternum, was that the woman who'd just backed him into a corner had grown up in foster homes, where Negro families had been kinder to her than white ones, had worked in factories during the war alongside Negro women who'd shared their lunches when she had nothing, who'd taught her to stand up for herself, who'd treated her like a person instead of a pretty face that might be useful someday, had been rescued from assault when she was 16 by a Negro janitor named James who'd heard her screaming in the factory bathroom and hadn't looked away, hadn't pretended not to hear, had kicked down the door and pulled the foreman off her and lost his job for it, and never once asked for thanks. Marilyn Monroe knew exactly what it meant to be looked at, but not seen, knew what it meant to be reduced to your surface, to have your humanity filed away as irrelevant, to be treated as a commodity instead of a person. She knew it in her bones, in her blood, in every audition where men stared at her chest instead of her face, and she'd be damned if she'd let it happen to Ella. 3 weeks earlier, Marilyn had been at a party in Beverly Hills, one of those parties that started at cocktail hour and devolved into something darker by midnight, the kind of party where everyone was drunk and cruel and honestly bored, where people said things they meant but pretended they didn't, where the veneer of Hollywood civility cracked just enough to see the rot underneath. She'd been cornered by a producer, one of the powerful ones whose name opened doors and ended careers, and he kept touching her lower back, his hand drifting lower with each anecdote, and he kept asking if the rumors about her measurements were true, if she'd really posed naked for that calendar, if she was really as friendly as people said. She was calculating her escape, mentally mapping the path to the bathroom or the garden or anywhere that wasn't here, when she'd heard it. A voice, coming from a record player in the corner, singing "Someone to Watch Over Me." The voice was velvet and honey and heartbreak all at once. It didn't perform the song the way most singers performed songs, hitting the notes and conveying the emotion in that technical way that impressed critics. This voice inhabited the song, made you believe that somewhere in the world, someone was actually watching over the singer. And she was grateful beyond words, and that gratitude was tinged with disbelief because good things didn't happen to people like her. It was the most honest thing Marilyn had heard in years. She'd walked away from the producer mid-sentence, leaving him standing there with his hand still extended toward her absent back, and followed the sound like a pilgrim following a star, like a woman dying of thirst following the promise of water. "Who is that?" she'd asked a woman standing near the record player. The woman, drunk on martinis and indifference, barely looked up from her conversation. She was talking to a director about a script she'd read, trying to angle for a part, playing the game that everyone played. "Ella Fitzgerald," she said dismissively. "She's a Negro jazz singer. Quite good, actually, if you like that sort of thing. If you like that sort of thing." As if genius could be reduced to personal preference. As if the voice coming from that record player wasn't rewriting the rules of what singing could be. Marilyn had stood there for the entire song, eyes closed, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not desire, not performance, not the constant calculation of who was watching and what they wanted and how she could give it to them while protecting the real her. Just recognition. This woman, this voice, this artist understood something fundamental about loneliness, about being looked at but never truly seen, about performing joy while dying inside, about being valued for the wrong things while the right things were dismissed as irrelevant. When the song ended, Marilyn opened her eyes. The party continued around her, people laughing and drinking and destroying each other with casual cruelty. "I need to meet her," she said. The woman laughed, sharp and bitter. "Good luck with that. She doesn't exactly run in our circles. The Negro clubs don't mix with Beverly Hills." But Marilyn Monroe had made a career out of getting what she wanted by making men think it was their idea, by playing dumb while thinking 3 moves ahead, by using her body as a distraction while her mind did the real work. She'd find Ella Fitzgerald, and she did. 2 days later, through Norman Granz, Ella's manager, who'd been shocked, genuinely shocked, speechless for 10 full seconds when Marilyn Monroe's assistant called requesting a meeting. Not a publicity stunt, not a photo op, a private meeting, just the two of them. They met at a small cafe in Los Angeles, the kind of place where the coffee was bad, but the anonymity was good, where nobody cared about autographs or photographs, because half the clientele was trying to avoid being recognized for various reasons. Marilyn arrived early, wearing sunglasses and a scarf, looking like every woman trying not to be recognized and thereby making herself more recognizable because desperation has a particular silhouette. Ella arrived exactly on time, looking exactly like herself, elegant, composed, in a dress that was expensive without being showy, with posture that suggested years of classical training or military school or both. Her eyes had seen too much and forgiven too little. They sat across from each other in a booth near the back, 2 women who lived on opposite sides of Hollywood's color line, and for the first few minutes, neither spoke. Marilyn ordered coffee she wouldn't drink. Ella ordered tea she'd barely touch. The waitress left. The silence stretched. Marilyn broke it first, because she'd been the one to request this meeting, because the burden of explanation was hers. "I heard you sing," she said simply, "someone to watch over me, at a party in Beverly Hills." Ella's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, maybe, or suspicion. Famous white actresses didn't usually seek out Negro jazz singers to talk about music. Usually they wanted something. A photo opportunity, a way to seem cultured and progressive, a story they could tell at cocktail parties. "Thank you," Ella said carefully, her voice measured. "I'm glad you enjoyed it." "Enjoyed it?" Marilyn shook her head. "That's not the right word. You made me cry. Not because it was sad, because it was true. You sang it like you meant every single word, like you weren't performing a song, like you were confessing something." Ella studied her for a long moment, her eyes searching Marilyn's face for the angle, for the manipulation, for whatever this was really about. "I did mean every word," she said finally. "I know." Marilyn took off her sunglasses, and without them her face was more naked, more vulnerable, more real. "That's the difference between us. You get to mean what you sing. I have to wiggle and breathe like a child, and pretend I don't have a brain, because that's what sells tickets. But you get to be real. You get to be an artist. Real." Ella's laugh was soft and bitter, the kind of laugh that comes from years of swallowing anger. "Miss Monroe, I'm a Negro woman in America. I'm real, all right. Too real. So real that most clubs won't book me, because their white customers don't want to look at me while they eat dinner. So real that I have to use service entrances and separate bathrooms. So real that critics write about my weight before they write about my voice. I'm drowning in real." Marilyn's face hardened in a way that photographers never captured, in a way that didn't fit the Marilyn Monroe brand. "Then we change that." "How?" Ella's voice was skeptical. "You going to integrate Hollywood with that wiggle?" "No." Marilyn leaned forward. "I'm going to use the thing they think makes me powerless, being underestimated, and turn it into a weapon. You tell me which club you want. I'll make it happen." Ella shook her head slowly. "You don't understand how this works." "I understand exactly how it works," Marilyn interrupted, her voice sharp now. "I've been underestimated my entire life. Every casting director who made me read for the same dumb blonde role 50 times. Every producer who grabbed my ass and called it a compliment. Every critic who wrote that I can't act. Every person who looked at my body and assumed my brain stopped working." She picked up her coffee cup, put it down without drinking. "And I learned that the trick isn't to fight the underestimation. That makes them defensive. The trick is to use it. Let them think you're stupid. Let them think you don't understand the game. And then when they're not watching because they think you're too dumb to matter, you make your move." Ella was silent, processing this, recalibrating her understanding of the woman across from her. "The Mocambo," she said finally. "Norman's been trying to get me in there for 2 years. Charlie Morrison keeps saying the clientele isn't ready, which is code for they're too racist. The clientele will be ready when I make them ready," Marilyn said with absolute certainty. "Give me 2 days." "And what do you want in return?" Ella asked, because nobody did something for nothing, because altruism was a fairy tale, and she'd stopped believing in fairy tales around the same time she'd started performing in clubs where she couldn't use the front door. Marilyn looked confused, genuinely confused. "In return, this is Hollywood. Everyone wants something. I want to hear you sing," Marilyn said simply. "I want to sit in that club and listen to real art for once instead of the manufactured garbage they make me perform. I want to be in a room where someone is telling the truth." She paused. "And I want to be your friend, if you'll let me." Ella didn't answer right away, just studied this strange, famous, complicated woman who'd sought her out, who'd listened to her record and heard something beyond the notes. "Okay," she said finally. 2 days. But if this is some publicity stunt, "It's not," Marilyn said. "I promise." And 3 weeks later, on March 15, 1955, Ella Fitzgerald walked onto the Mocambo stage for the first time. The room was packed beyond capacity, every table full, every seat taken, people standing 3 deep at the bar. The fire marshal would have shut them down if he'd known, but Morrison had paid him to look the other way, because this was the biggest night in the Mocambo's history, and sitting at the front table, wearing a white dress that photographed like moonlight, like something pure and impossible, was Marilyn Monroe. She'd kept her promise, showed up opening night 30 minutes early, caused chaos just by existing. The photographers had nearly rioted trying to get shots of her walking in. The gossip columnists had surrounded her table like wolves. Every star in Hollywood suddenly had business at the Mocambo that night. And through it all, Marilyn sat perfectly still, perfectly composed, and waited for Ella to sing. When the lights dimmed and Ella walked onto that stage, there was a moment of collective surprise. The white audience hadn't quite processed that the evening's entertainment was going to be Negro. Morrison had buried it in the advertising, mentioned special guest without specifying. Some people shifted uncomfortably, some whispered to their companions, some reached for their coats, and then Ella opened her mouth and sang. The first song was, "It Don't Mean a Thing, If It Ain't Got That Swing." Upbeat, playful, impossible not to love. Her voice filled the room like weather, like a force of nature that couldn't be argued with or dismissed. By the second verse, people had stopped reaching for their coats. By the chorus, they were smiling, and by the end, they were applauding like they'd discovered something new, something they'd been missing without knowing it. Marilyn applauded harder than anyone. Didn't just politely clap, actually applauded with enthusiasm, with joy, with the kind of genuine response that couldn't be faked. The photographers captured it. The next day, every paper in Los Angeles ran photos of Marilyn Monroe applauding Ella Fitzgerald, and just like that, it became acceptable. If Marilyn Monroe loved Ella Fitzgerald, then loving Ella Fitzgerald was fashionable, desirable, the thing that sophisticated people did. On the third night, Ella sang Misty. It was a song about longing, about being hopelessly lost in someone else, about vulnerability so complete it felt like drowning. The arrangement was slow, intimate, stripped down to just piano and bass, and Ella's voice was naked in that way that great art is naked, exposing something true and painful and beautiful. Halfway through, Marilyn started crying, not the delicate, pretty crying of movies where a single tear rolls down a powdered cheek, real crying, tears running down her face, smearing her mascara, ruining her makeup, while she sat in the front row and didn't bother to hide it, didn't bother to dab at her eyes with a handkerchief, just let herself feel it. The photographers captured that too. The next day, the headline in Variety read, "Monroe weeps at Mocambo. Fitzgerald's voice moves Hollywood's toughest blonde." The article was condescending, vaguely mocking, the way articles always were when women showed emotion in public. It suggested that Marilyn's tears were surprising, that her emotional response revealed unexpected depth, that perhaps there was more to the blonde bombshell than anyone had realized. It was patronizing as hell, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that Ella Fitzgerald was now bankable, major news, the kind of story that sold papers. After that week, every major club in America wanted her. The Copper, the Blue Note, Carnegie Hall, doors that had been closed for decades suddenly opened. Because Marilyn Monroe had sat in the front row and cried. Because Marilyn Monroe, box office gold, had declared with her presence and her tears that Ella Fitzgerald was worth paying attention to. Backstage on the final night, Ella found Marilyn in the dressing room she'd insisted they give her, even though stars usually didn't share dressing rooms with Negro performers. Marilyn was touching up her makeup, repairing the damage from another night of crying during the performance. Their eyes met in the mirror. "You didn't have to do this," Ella said quietly. Marilyn set down the makeup brush, turned to face Ella directly. "Yes, I did." "Why?" The question hung in the air between them. Marilyn stood up, smoothed her white dress, and when she spoke, her voice was Norma Jean's voice, the girl from the foster homes, not Marilyn's manufactured whisper. "Because you're the greatest singer alive, and nobody should have to beg to be heard. Because I know what it's like to be looked at but not seen. Because a long time ago, when I was nobody, when I was just Norma Jean working in a factory, a Negro woman named Grace McKee Goddard took me into her foster home and treated me like I mattered when nobody else did. And I've never forgotten that." She paused. "And because I'm tired of pretending to be stupid, I'm tired of wiggling and giggling and letting men think I'm just a body with no brain. You get to be an artist, Ella. You get to be respected for your talent, and I want that too. And if I can't have it yet, at least I can help you keep it." "Then why not just demand respect?" Ella asked. "Why play the game?" "Because they won't listen if I demand it. They'll call me difficult, ungrateful, a bitch. They'll replace me with the next blonde. But if I manipulate them, if I use the dumb blonde act to make them think they're in control while I'm actually moving all the pieces, then I win. The trick is knowing which tool to use for which job." Marilyn walked to the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. You changed my life with your voice, Ella. You reminded me that real art exists, that truth exists. I just wanted to return the favor. She left before Ella could respond, before the weight of gratitude and understanding could turn into something more complicated. Years later, after Marilyn died in 1962, alone in her bed with empty pill bottles scattered like prayers that went unanswered, Ella Fitzgerald would tell this story in interviews. She'd tell it slowly, carefully, making sure people understood the importance of it. Marilyn Monroe was the reason I had a career, she'd say. Before her, I was relegated to Negro clubs and small venues. After her, I sang at Carnegie Hall, at the Hollywood Bowl, at the White House. She changed my life with one phone call and 7 nights at the Mocambo. Interviewers would nod, would write it down, but wouldn't quite understand the depth of it. She was an unusual woman, Ella said in a 1972 interview. Her voice still velvet, even at 55, even after decades of performing. A little ahead of her time, and she didn't know it. What do you mean? The interviewer pressed. Ella smiled sadly. She thought she was using the dumb blonde act to manipulate people. But really, she was trapped by it. She could free me, but she couldn't free herself, and that was the tragedy. After the Mocambo triumph, after the headlines and the photographs and the victory, Marilyn went back to Hollywood, back to the wiggling and the breathless voice, and the roles that required nothing but beauty and availability. She fought for better parts, for dramatic roles, for the chance to be taken seriously as an actress. Sometimes she won small victories, mostly she lost. The studio system that had built Marilyn Monroe couldn't let Norma Jean exist. There was too much money in the fantasy, too much profit in the blonde bombshell who made men feel powerful and women feel threatened. The woman who'd backed Charlie Morrison into a corner, who'd weaponized her image to open doors for Ella Fitzgerald, who'd cried real tears at the Mocambo while photographers captured her surprising depth, that woman was filed away as an anomaly. A nice story. A moment of unexpected grace from an actress who usually played dumb. Nobody asked what it cost her to play dumb. Nobody wondered what kind of intelligence it took to sustain a performance that convincing for 10 years. Nobody saw that Marilyn Monroe was the greatest actress of her generation, precisely because she'd convinced the world she couldn't act, except Ella. Ella saw it. On the night Marilyn died, August 5, 1962, Ella was performing at the Hollywood Bowl. Someone told her between sets, whispered it backstage, and Ella had stood there holding the news like broken glass. She'd gone back on stage for the second half, and dedicated Someone to Watch Over Me to Marilyn's memory. Her voice had cracked only once, on the line, "Won't you tell her please, to put on some speed, follow my lead, oh how I need, someone to watch over me." The audience had applauded. Most of them didn't understand why that song, why that dedication. But Ella did. Afterward, a reporter asked if she and Marilyn had been close friends. No, Ella admitted honestly. We only met a handful of times, but she watched over me when nobody else would. She used her power to give me mine. She'd stopped, choosing her words carefully, and I think she spent her whole life watching over other people, making other people feel seen, and I don't think anybody watched over her, not really. The reporter had written it down but hadn't included it in the article. It didn't fit the narrative that was already forming, the story that was already being told about Marilyn Monroe, tragic blonde, sex symbol, woman who died young and beautiful and alone. She wasn't supposed to be complicated, wasn't supposed to be a civil rights advocate, wasn't supposed to be the woman who'd integrated the Mocambo through sheer strategic brilliance, but she was. In March 1955, for 7 nights, Marilyn Monroe sat in the front row of the Mocambo and applauded and cried and refused to hide her emotional response while Ella Fitzgerald sang, and in doing so, she'd changed American music forever, not with speeches, not with protests, not with the kind of activism that gets remembered in history books or taught in schools, but with a phone call, a promise, 7 nights of showing up, and the willingness to be photographed caring about someone other than herself. The dumb blonde had outsmarted the entire entertainment industry, and nobody had even noticed until it was already done. 50 years later, in 2005, a music historian named David was researching the integration of Los Angeles nightclubs for his dissertation and stumbled across the story. He tracked down the interview with Ella, the photographs of Marilyn at the Mocambo, the timeline of Ella's career explosion. He wrote an article titled, "The Night Marilyn Monroe Integrated the Mocambo." It went viral in academic circles. Jazz historians called it a revelation. Civil rights scholars added it to their syllabi. Music lovers shared it on early social media platforms. And slowly, gradually, the story became part of both women's legacies. Marilyn Monroe, the sex symbol who'd used her power to fight racism. Ella Fitzgerald, the genius who'd finally gotten her due because a blonde actress refused to accept injustice. 2 women, 2 different kinds of performance. 1 moment of solidarity that changed everything. The phone call that Charlie Morrison received that afternoon in 1955 lasted less than 3 minutes, but it echoed for decades. Because sometimes revolution doesn't look like revolution. Sometimes it looks like a blonde woman in a white dress, sitting in the front row, crying real tears while a Negro woman sings about being lost in love. Sometimes it looks like friendship. Sometimes it looks like manipulation. Sometimes it looks like both at once. And sometimes, just sometimes, it looks like Marilyn Monroe, being exactly who she was, underneath all the platinum hair and red lipstick and studio-manufactured persona, Norma Jean, who remembered every kindness, who hated injustice viscerally, who understood that power was only worth having if you used it to open doors for people who'd been locked out. The cameras caught her crying at the Mocambo. They thought it was surprising, unexpected, a moment of depth from a shallow woman. But Ella knew better. Those weren't tears of surprise. Those were tears of recognition, of one performer seeing another, of one woman who'd been underestimated her entire life, watching another woman who'd been dismissed for different reasons, and thinking, not on my watch, not while I have the power to change it. The Mocambo closed in 1958, 3 years after Ella's legendary week. The building was torn down to make way for a parking lot, because Los Angeles eats its own history without remorse. But the photographs remain. Marilyn in white, sitting front row, her face caught mid-emotion, Ella on stage, mid-song, her voice captured in the tilt of her head, the openness of her expression. Two women who changed the world by refusing to accept it as it was. And if you look closely at those photographs, really closely, the way historians and fans and people who care about these things look, you can see it in Marilyn's face. Not the mask, not the performance, but Norma Jean, the girl who'd grown up on the wrong side of every line Hollywood drew. The woman who'd learned to cross those lines by making people think she didn't understand they existed. The actress who'd spent her entire career being underestimated and had finally figured out that underestimation was its own kind of power. She's smiling in those photographs. But it's not the Marilyn smile, the practiced curve of lips designed to sell tickets and magazines. It's something real, something true, something that says, I see you, Ella, I see your genius, I see your struggle, and I'm going to make sure the whole world sees it too. That smile lasted for 7 nights in March 1955. Then she went back to being Marilyn Monroe full-time, the blonde bombshell, the sex symbol, the woman who supposedly couldn't act and definitely couldn't think. But for those 7 nights at the Mocambo, she'd been Norma Jean, and Norma Jean had changed the world.